From October 23rd to November 11th, 1942, the Allied and Axis armies squared off in the North African desert in the Battle of El Alamein. This battle would prove to be a vital strategic and emotional victory for the Allied forces, who eventually crushed the German Afrika Korps after weeks of intense fighting. Going into the battle, the Allied leaders understood that they needed a clear victory in the desert if they wanted to defeat the Nazis overall. At this time in Europe, as you can see, the Nazis seemed to have full control of France. They were pushing the Russians backwards in Operation Barbarossa, and they were keeping the British Navy in check in the Battle of the Atlantic. If the Germans were able to move through North Africa and capture the Suez Canal supply route in the Persian oil fields, they would deal a massive blow to the suffering Allied morale. The Battle of El Alamein truly seemed like a last stand for the Allied forces. The Allied forces at El Alamein were led by British General B.L. Montgomery. Monty, as he was called, was actually a recent arrival to the North African theater. In August 1942, he had replaced General Auchinleck in North Africa at the order of a frustrated Winston Churchill. Montgomery was a massively capable but very controversial commander. He had a great knowledge of tactics and strategy. He understood when it was best to be aggressive and when to be conservative. He also had a special ability to rally his troops with rousing speeches. Before the fighting at El Alamein, in fact, Montgomery inspired his troops with the words, "All that is necessary is that each and every officer and man should enter this battle with a determination to see it through, to fight and kill, and finally to win. If we do this, there can be only one result. Together, we will hit the enemy for 6 out of Africa." Despite his many admirable qualities, Montgomery was widely regarded as arrogant and prideful. In fact, after the Allied victory at El Alamein, he would give himself all of the credit for the victory, claiming that the battle was, quote, "without parallel in history." On the opposite side of the fighting, the Axis powers were led by the legendary General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. He had grown to fame leading Axis armies in France and North Africa. He was a strategic genius and a master of desert warfare. With his signature tank flanking strategy, he had been able to win many battles, even while outgunned and outmanned. Rommel was going to need to employ all of his military genius to win the Battle of El Alamein. He was outnumbered by the Allies, who had 74,000 more men, 460 more tanks, and 400 more artillery pieces than the Axis. Moreover, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had been able to decipher Axis communications, allowing the Allies to destroy the majority of reinforcements sent to Rommel from Germany. Moreover, as you can see on the map, the Allies had intentionally positioned themselves at El Alamein between the Mediterranean Sea and the Qattara Depression, a massive plain of impassable quicksand. This position neutralized Rommel's ability to outflank the Allied forces, his favorite move. At the outset of the conflict, the Allies began by constructing a dummy army south of the place where they intended to attack. Operation Bertram, as it was called, successfully deceived Rommel and the Axis, convincing them that the Allied offensive would come from the south. Next, to take advantage of the enemy's misjudgment, the Allies began their main attack in a move codenamed Operation Lightfoot. Under the cover of darkness, Allied infantry crossed a 5-mile minefield, the Devil's Garden, clearing a path through the mines for tanks to pass through. While this offensive did not make it all of the way through the minefield, it allowed the Allies to dig trenches and set up strategic positions from which they could fire relentlessly on the exhausted Axis army. Interestingly, on the day of the attack, October 23rd, General Rommel was forced to take a flight back to Germany due to an illness. In his absence, General George von Stumme led the Axis troops, and though he was an experienced commander, he did not share Rommel's strategic brilliance. Fortunately for the Axis, Rommel returned on October 25th to retake his position at the head of the army. After the partial success of Operation Lightfoot, Montgomery began the second phase of his battle plan. Dubbed Operation Supercharge, Montgomery planned to attack the Axis line at a point closer to the Mediterranean Sea in the north. In a similar fashion to the first phase, Montgomery began the offensive with a false attack by an Australian unit away from the main site. The Axis thus distracted, the Allies pushed through the Axis lines, relying on their superior tanks and strength in numbers to break the enemy position. At this point, Rommel had no choice but to retreat. His defenses were penetrated, his men were outnumbered, and he was almost out of supplies. However, when Rommel reported his plan to Hitler in Germany, Hitler responded harshly, ordering Rommel to, quote, "stand and die." Interestingly, Rommel refused to lead his men to certain death, and he chose not to obey the Führer's order. Thus, Rommel and the Afrika Korps retreated from El Alamein towards Libya and Tunisia. After the dust settled at El Alamein, the Allies celebrated a much-needed victory. They had asserted Allied dominance of Western Africa, repelled a strong German advance, and protected Egypt and Persia as Allied supply depots. Later on, El Alamein would actually be seen as a critical turning point on the North African front. Moreover, Winston Churchill would even go as far as calling the battle a turning point in the war as a whole. He referred to El Alamein as the, quote, "end of the beginning of the war." However accurate that claim may be, there is no doubt that El Alamein was a crucial victory for an Allied side that desperately needed a win. El Alamein, uniquely, would be the only major land battle won by the British without American aid. Thus, after El Alamein, with the combination of greater morale and fresh American troops, the Allied forces would begin to turn the tide of the war in their favor.